Drake makes me want to go to my girl's house and throw rose quartz through a window. Oh, yeah.
Yep. All the Drake memes. Oh, I'm gonna start letting people in. All right.
You're right, it can start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is our special on the issue of decolonizing disability studies. We've got some real good, great guests for you. So I'm gonna let Renika take over. Do we have any captions for ASL? Teresa,
I'm sorry, what was that, Mama?
do we have any captions for ASL?
Captions. 1 second. Yeah. Yes, I will put that on. Hold on.
Great, thank you.
We have the Otter AI, so I will drop that in the chat so people can follow along.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Does Wellness Screen say?
So let me pass it on to Renika, and when we're ready, we can get everybody in.
Hi, Velma. One moment. We're just dealing with some technical difficulties on this end.
Okay. Dr. Kansi, welcome. Thank you for being here and being our guest speaker or panelist. Shane, you're there too. Thank you for being here. Where is Dr. Rocky?
I'm right here. Hello.
Hi, hang on. I'm looking for you. There you are. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Annabelle? Great, thank you. So everybody's here. And we're just waiting. Oh, great, great. There's Renika.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you everybody for joining us for our Decolonizing Disability Studies Lunch and Learn. I am going to, you said that we have everybody on the call. Yes.
I think most everybody.
Yes, I see everybody.
Yeah,
perfect.
All our panelists.
Perfect. Well, yes, so I'm going to allow for our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will get into this great discussion that we have planned today. And to our panelists, just when I ask the questions, please feel free just to jump in. I will call you if I have to, but I don't need to. So awesome. And I will start with Dr. Rocky Torres.
Hello, Dr. Rocky Torres. He, him, his pronouns, Latinx, and I am the Executive Director of Special Education and Inclusion for Seattle Public Schools. Pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Pedroza?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Constance Pedroza, Seattle Public Schools Associate Superintendent. I'm also Latinx. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. And Shane?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shane Baguya. I'm Filipino. I'm a program specialist with Seattle Public Schools and Advanced Learning. I'm also a part-time instructor, adjunct faculty at Seattle University. I'm also a CRE racial equity coach as well. Thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you. And Annabelle?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annabelle Garcia Andreessen. I am a special education preschool teacher with Seattle Public Schools. I go by, my pronouns are she and her. And I have been part of this developmental preschool program for 16 school years now. And I am really excited to be here as a part of this panel, and am very honored to be a part of this panel as well. Thank you for having me. And I am also Filipino American.
Thank you. All right, so to get us started, if we wanted to, so looking at decolonizing disability studies, if we wanted to decolonize disability studies, where do we start, or where could we start?
It's funny because we were talking about a little bit that those are good questions. These are great questions. And I think this is what I think in terms of thinking. So just full disclosure to this group, I was also the former director of racial equity advancement for Seattle Public Schools. And so we've been thinking a lot about this. And I think what we have to really be thinking about is we have a lot that is great about IDEA, but when it was developed years and years ago, it was within the construct of our system. And it was in the construct of the current systems that we have. And I believe that anything, not just anything about disability studies, but anything that we think about when we think about targeting and decolonizing, that means that we have to actually start over in thinking about how do we do that? How do we actually redesign with centering the most vulnerable person in the system? And what does that look like? That's actually having the most impact of the system that's currently in place. And so when I think about that, and I think about white supremacy, I think about how that has constructed some design principles for how we constructed everything from our legal system, who it protects, who has access to it. I believe it's about then thinking about then how do we flip the script on that and redesigning with the most vulnerable person in the system, which is the student with disabilities, but also impacted by race. And how do we do that? And then because what we've learned is that when we do that, that other students actually benefit. And so how do we do that? I'm gonna let my other panelists just weigh in on that.
Yeah, I'll build on that a little bit. Like the question is really deep at its core, because if we're thinking about decolonizing, it just automatically brings in the idea of colonization and how that happened and who did it. And so if we think about it in that respect, the idea that Dr. Kansi is talking about around like the white supremacist culture, that is very much at the root. So until we can start to unpack that root a bit, it begs the question, are we going to be able to get the traction that we need? Because that is kind of where we need to start understanding that the system was created within a system of oppression, for lack of a better term. So it's really deep. And so it's not to say that you don't go and try to improve it, but I think there needs to be a very clear understanding as well that how deep and entrenched this is, the roots of it are the roots of it, and that's where we need to start.
I would also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please, after you. No, you first, Annabelle. Nice to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you in a long time.
As well, Shane. It
It's been a
has
long
been a
time.
while. I was just going to add to that. We definitely want to also just start with within ourselves as well, acknowledge that we all participate in and benefit from disability oppression as well. And that part of that is also learning and including all of the histories that we are, that haven't been heard, as well as what has been created and what has been reported to us, right? So that's another way of kind of like starting that conversation and starting us off in this movement to work towards.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Pedrosa. Thank you so much, Dr. Rocky and Annabelle, I want to add to that. I think, again, like really defining and unpacking decolonizing, just like what Dr. Rocky was saying in disability studies. And it really is that intersection. When we are decolonizing anything, then we are acknowledging the wrongdoings of white supremacy, specifically white patriarchy and capitalism. And then at the same time, we know that there is significant value within indigenous cultural knowledge that was here and predating colonization. So colonization has conditioned us to really dehumanize people, specifically people of color. And because of this, our US system and our current structures, I believe, shows really three trends when I think about and I look at the public school system, especially with special education. I sort of see that students of color are labeled disabled when they actually may not be, because cultural differences are seen as deficits. I also see students of color that may not be labeled as disabled when they actually may need help and supports. And that's because systems and structures are really not culture responsive, and they are primarily responding to white privilege instead. And the last trend that I see is that when students of color are finally labeled as disabled, quote unquote, then they're actually treated harsher and have poorer quality of services than their white student counterparts. And like what we were saying earlier, all of these reasons above where these trends and patterns is because of white supremacy. And really public education was built on white supremacy. I'm gonna put a link in the chat, and this link in the chat is gonna be from Uncle Sam Teaches the World. And I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but this kind of just shows like the significant impact of colonization on US public education system. There's a link in the chat there, and maybe I can actually even cut that picture and put it in there as well. But you know, in terms of the link in the chat, you might see a picture here, and this teacher is Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam back in the day is that popular US cartoon figure throughout history. And he's really trying to teach and discipline the US territories of at the time, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And the new students are really unhappy with his authority. And then what we see here is actually a Black African-American student in the back of the picture, in the back of the room, really just kind of, cleaning the window there. And in the corner, there's a Native American student reading a book, and the book has ABCs upside down. And then there's an Asian student in the back, that just outside the door, there's other students in the room too. And then you'll see, you can't really see the scribbles, but in this picture, if you click on that link, but it says the consent of the governmental is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England was governed, her colonies, whether they consented or not, but no waiting for their consent should advance the world's civilization. The US must govern its new territories with or without consent until they can govern themselves. Uncle Sam, now children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not, but just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while you will feel glad to be here as they are. And so this is again, how that white supremacy movement is impacting children of color within the public education system. As I look at this picture here, I think the most heinous picture and visualization is really that Black male student in the back of the classroom, because he's actually at the very back of the classroom, not even getting an education. So I just kind of wanted to put this picture up. This is really from 1899, January 25th, and this is from Puck, and this was just a visualization of picture, and I do believe that sometimes picture speaks 1,000 words, and this was like shown throughout the US anyway.
Thank you, Shane. So I wanted to, how can we identify, talk about, and center disabilities in ways that decolonize the ways that we police these bodies?
I'm gonna just start again. I just want to say that this is something we've been talking about for a long time in the system. I don't know if anyone here knows that we just redid our policy and procedures for isolation and restraint, which is another example of policing within our school system, in my opinion. And I believe that it has been a really long effort. There's a lot of, it's still a lot of processes and thinking about the work that needs to happen, because now it's the real work. You can draft policy and procedures, but at the end of the day, it's about making sure that staff is supported and trained in understanding their biases during these situations, because when things happen, people are really stressed out, right? Things that happen as students deregulated, or there's a conflict, and people's amygdalas are hijacked. And what the research has shown is that when people are really, fight or flight, when people are really stressed out or feel there's a conflict, that's when we revert back to biased decision-making. Biased decision-making is in our DNA. And so we have to mitigate for that all the time in our school system, and thinking about how do we interfere that? How do we impact that? How do we impact the reversing back biased decision-making, get people into a calm space to make better decisions around how to support children? Because as we all know, when students are actually having moments of distress, it is because the student's having a moment of distress, which might be related to trauma. It might be related to something else. And our job as adults is to support that child in helping them, get back into a calm space. And it's not about policing children. It's not about making these arbitrary lines of rules and regulations and procedures. And I think the work has to start with us. But I do believe staff need supports, resources, and tools, and they need to continue to unpack their own biases when they're making these decisions. It is not an accident that students of color are the highest number of students in our most intensive services in Seattle Public Schools. And I would argue that probably many of them are due to behavior. And so that is the data we have. And we have more numbers of white students that are in resource and access. That is also our data that we have that is there and prevalent. And so that is work that we have to do, but not just in special education, in general education as well, because we also have that with our discipline data as well, that the higher number of students being suspended on the regular are students of color in our system. And so it's about the impact of all of that in thinking about how do we support our staff and our families, really, in understanding how do we get at this place of understanding the impact of bias and stress and all of these things into these decisions. But how do we actually so we can prevent and we can say that this can't happen. But we all know that still happens. We see it in society all the time. And so I think it's really important that we have to really educate people, educate our police force, security, staff, students, community, teachers, families, all at the same time, and even the students in understanding that this, we should not be accepting any of these behaviors at all in terms of how we impact a student, especially when they're having a stressful moment in a classroom, in a hallway. It's our job to support them. And it's our job to also figure out how to make sure that the adults have the tools to do that well. And what does that mean in terms of resources and all of those other pieces? I'm speaking from a strictly, so that's the work that's on us, is how do you can design something, but how do you make sure that all of those pieces are embedded into ensuring that it's implemented with that at the end of the day, the student is still in a safe, secure space and can learn and can be happy, or when they're not happy, that they get the supports they need to do what they need to do to really thrive in school. It's very complex. It's not easy, but race and bias has to be part of those conversations when we're talking about designing supports for students and for teachers and adults in the system.
Yeah, I want to build on some stuff that Dr. Pedrosa was sharing there. And I also, when I looked at this question, it took me back to the picture that Shane just shared. And the reason it did is I would push to say, it's not in the image, but if we were to have a student with a disability in the image, they would have been in the front row along with all the other students of color. And the reason being, when I looked at that image, if you look at the back row, those students who are sitting there conforming, reading, and white are all being left alone and they're okay. But if you weren't one of those things at that time, you were in that front row and there was something wrong with you. And it's important because if we think about it in context, this is the late 1800s, but this is what formed a lot of how our systems and policies work now. So the idea of where do we go to stop policing bodies? Well, one, the policing of the bodies has been entrenched for people of color and for students and people with disabilities for years. It's the origin of the system. So in some ways, if we're thinking about how do we untangle that, I think some of the work starts with identifiers and really getting what that is. We all have our own identity that's developed through the years, whether it's through race, through culture, through language, disability, different things, but those are our identifiers. And so when we're doing work with educators to try to get them to see that, it's the idea of appreciating other people's identifiers so that you understand it. It's not deficit thinking. There's assets there and we need to recognize those assets. When we get to a place where we can get people to start recognizing those assets, then we start getting away from policing of bodies because we're not seeing it as a problem. We're not seeing it as something that needs to be policed. We're recognizing it as an asset and also seeing it as, the dominant white culture, for example, in this picture, they're different somewhere too. If those kids would have gone to a different space, they would have been different. And so trying to also create that empathy loop around like, how would you feel if you were looked at differently or treated differently? But I think a lot of it, when we think about policing of bodies, lives in people's own identifiers and then creating appreciation for those things versus looking at them through a deficit lens.
Anybody you want to go? You sure? Okay. Well, I'm glad you're here because I think we have a family in common that I was working with that I want to kind of shed some light on. And so I really appreciate the question, how do we decolonize disability studies around policing? But my first question is like, why are we policing? Like, why does that have to happen? I was working with a family that Annabelle knows very, very well. And as I was working with this family and the mom had such a different perspective than the dad. And it was a multiracial child. And when it came down to it, we're talking about different categories for special ed and different routes we can go and just talking about realness when it comes to race. And he really said, Shane, he said, it was a 2-hour conversation. He said, look at me, as a vet, as a disabled vet that's Black. Like I'm seen as a threat. I'm seen as unsafe. And he, as a wheelchair bound person, that for me was a little bit of a shock because I would have thought that people would have much more care and compassion for this person that's bound to a wheelchair. But when you hear vet, and then when you add race to that, and then you see disability, you think unpredictability, you think threat, right? But I think unpacking that and having that conversation, but still we need systems, not about policing, but systems of care and compassion. And so I bring that story up because it reminds me that yes, people are policed in ways where race is front and center and they're policed because of race when really they need care and compassion around their disability.
When I was thinking about this particular question too, and then also hearing what everyone else on the panel has said, it really did kind of where I started to kind of look at it is how do we, it's how we are defining what behaviors, it's within that system of white supremacy, right? What behaviors are acceptable and what behaviors are not acceptable. And when you really think about it, all behaviors have a meaning. There's always, every child, every student, every person, whatever behavior comes out of you is because of something, right? And it's valid. And I think the first thing to do is to really validate that for all of our students, for all of our students, because once we validate that and we make sure that this is acceptable, no matter what the reaction is. We all have different reactions to the same thing. or we could have same reactions to the same thing, that and we start to normalize that, whatever normal means, right? Then that's kind of part of that decolonization of it, right? Part of breaking that down so that our communities can learn that these behaviors happen for a reason. There are ways that we can work through them, and there are ways that we can teach each other and learn to understand how this goes. We may not understand it completely because of course, a behavior stems from many different things, right? There's not one reason why someone reacts in one way to something. So when I'm thinking about that, it's talking about teaching it to, as a teacher, for me, it's about teaching it to the students, to my community, that it is okay to have a reaction to have whatever reaction you're having. It is okay for that to happen, even if there are policies and things that are telling us that it's not, right? And then from there, going to, like we talked about, going to the adults that are teaching, the adults that are the caregivers or the people that are around these young people, and saying to them, that it's okay that we don't understand where they're coming from. That, that's why we work on this together as a community. We work together to understand what's going on here. And then to also give tools. We're talking about giving tools. So giving tools about self-regulation. A lot of things that are happening now. One of the more, I guess, popular or that's coming into vogue now, I guess, would be like mindfulness, right? Using mindfulness. So again, a lot of these programs do have a roots in some kind of white supremacist or even like roots, right? There are a lot of that come into that, right? Because again, if we go deeper into it, but what we can do as a community is understand where that stems from, going back to that history of what it is, of that strategy that we're trying to teach students in when it comes to self-regulation or when it comes to expressing how they are and who they are, right? And then examining those and then kind of incorporating what we know about our histories, what we know about student histories and identities. And then from there, coming to an understanding of what we can do and what will hopefully work. And it gets tricky because we don't want to recreate or make a system that still is within a system that oppresses, right? That's the tricky part of decolonization, is knowing that a lot of it has to do with making sure that we are knowing our place in it, because decolonization will happen through the indigenous community. All of us other like settlers, regardless of if we are people of color, all of us have a role in how colonialism plays in our community, in our society. So again, just kind of thinking on that too, where we are, because we as a group can create something different, right? But if it's not truly decolonizing it with our indigenous folks as well, then we risk creating the same wheel with a different name. So we risk creating more policies that police the bodies and things like that too. So something to think about.
I just want to answer Donna's question in the chat here. So for me, I use a lot of different strategies, but I actually struggle with a significant, I'm a chronic stutterer. So I do have that. My mom also has significant traumatic brain injury. So I grew up with a mom with TBI. My son also has an IEP for speech. I also have been, since the age of 5, or actually before that, I have chronic illness with asthma, and I've been hospitalized a lot. And so when we think about disabled people, I wanted to put that out there in answering Donna's question in the chat. I also have previous experience as a school psychologist and school counselor too.
And I think that is an important, I think we should get that question at the end, because I think that's about, when we think about how do we really bring in the voices, right, of Black and Brown youth with disabilities into that conversation. And I think that's something that we need to really think about as a system when we're really talking about centering students with disabilities in the conversation, student voice. It has to include those students. And I mean, really thinking about inclusionary issues long-term, not just these special clubs or things, like what does that really mean to see that in leadership? What does that mean at all levels of the system? So I just want to put that out there as a secondary question, but to answer her question. So I have some health impairments that I don't want to disclose, but I do have a couple of them. I have from a family of many disabilities. We were just speaking about that when I was talking to both Shane and Rocky. Also the thought about just disabilities and how I grew up. Because many of my family members have we have blindness, deafness, spinal bifida, and then I have two nephews with autism, as well as my own. He's Latino Arab son in the school system with autism, and a daughter with dyslexia. So I have several disabilities within my family, and they're also impacted by the intersectionality of race within our school system as well. So that is my personal experience.
Thank you for sharing. I wanted to, so kind of thinking about colonization and race, but moving slightly from that, is how do we address disabilities that have been caused by colonizers, such as mental health and physical trauma from war/colonization, nuclear testing, and from other colonial exploitation and violence that have lasting disabling impacts on those who are colonized?
And I'm going to put something in the chat, and I'm going to let other people speak, but I'm going to put something in the chat because I'm going to refer to it. I'm going to put in the chat a frame for a title discussed about racing aces, because it actually puts another layer on trauma. So when we talk about trauma-informed practices, even trauma-informed practices is actually created from a white construct. So I just want to acknowledge that in this space. And I want to make sure when we talk about the impacts of racialized trauma, that we're actually talking about that and its impact in our DNA over centuries and years. And so I'm going to put the frame of racing aces in the chat as a reference point, but I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that too, that not only is there health impairments that have actually happened through the construct of white supremacy in our system, but I want to add that racialized trauma is another form of has to be visible. And it's something that we have to talk about that isn't discussed openly. But I'm going to put that reference in the chat and let my panelists discuss as I do that.
And Monica, I think some of us had the other question, so I don't know about that one. Do you mind saying it again? Thank you so much, Juanita.
Yes. The question that I had was, how do we address disabilities that have been caused by colonizers, such as mental health and physical trauma from war/colonization, nuclear testing, to other colonial exploitation and violence that have lasting disabling impacts on those who are colonized? Even, generational impacts as well. And if you wanted some time to let that question marinate and think on that question, I do have a question from the chat that we can address. So from Jerry, has Seattle Public ever considered a truth and reconciliation process to provide a safe platform for BIPOC students with disability to talk about their experiences in the system? For example, students who have experienced isolation and restraint could share how that impacted them as the district is pivoting towards a different style of behavioral management and support.
I'll just share that one of our goals from the system standpoint, we've just hired our first restorative justice coordinator in the system with the goal to expand restorative justice in our system. So that is also in partnership with the work that we're doing around the isolation restraint policy that we just just got approved from the school board. So restorative justice has to be part of that process, not only at the school level, but at the systems level as well. And we're also talking about restorative justice in terms of harm that has been done to even adults in the system in terms of how do we do that with staff as well. And so restorative justice has been one of the frames that we're using as our way to do repair and really focus, because we are actually be sharing pretty soon with the community our responding to hate and bias guidelines and protocols with the entire community and families. And part of that work is, and part of our procedures is, number one, what is the wraparound supports for the student who's experiencing that trauma? So what is the wraparound support for the students? What's the wraparound support for the family? What does that look like with regards to restorative practices? And then what does that look like as a continual basis in terms of support? Because making sure that if the student might need some mental health supports, what does that mean for this additional? We're also having additional social workers as part of our culture of care for students as well. So we're trying to triangulate it from multiple levels because for some families, restorative process might be what they need. For other families and students who've really suffered through multiple years of trauma, they may need something more specific. So that is something that we're addressing system-wide, is where you have to begin to scale it up. But that is something that we're really focused on in terms of that work moving forward. So that's a good question. I'm gonna pause. I'm still trying to get the Racing Aces online. I can't do two things at the same time. I apologize. So.
Really quickly, I just want to pop in and ask our panelists, for our closed captions, can you please state your name before you speak? Thank you. And Dr. Rocky, I think I might have interrupted you.
No, I'm good. Dr. Rocky Torres, I wanted to at least start to touch on your initial question around when the harm was caused by the colonizer, essentially. And I think some of that is even some of the work we're doing now, like a lunch and learn now around this conversation, because if we think about it, a lot of what has to happen in those cases would be to get to the roots. Like, what is the root of how this is happening? What is the root of how this was caused? And so conversations such as this one are some of the first steps to get people to get to some clarity around, yeah, there's certain things that have caused trauma or harm. How do we get to the roots of those to then think about how are we going to make this right? Similar to how Dr. Kansi was talking about restorative practices, restorative justice, when there is harm, there is some sort of how do we make this right? So we're thinking about it in a big macro picture. Now, similar to your question, over all these pieces that have happened by colonizers, it's about getting to the roots of it so that we can figure out how to re-untangle some of this. And then for those that were harmed, how is a larger macro level system working on those pieces? And that's a bigger thing for us to wrestle with essentially as a country in a lot of ways, but that is kind of like where my thinking goes when we start thinking about those things.
I think building off of what Dr. Rocky was saying is that taking care of the impacts based upon those trauma, those physical impacts, psychological impacts, but also preserving the culture, preserving that cultural knowledge, because again, it really is upholding and making sure that there's not any erasure with that indigenous culture or the culture that was there before that colonization was happening as well. So maintaining that as best as possible and also respecting that as well.
I would also just add to that, just bringing their stories forward and having their lived experiences being visible and relevant and providing that space for it. I think that's one of the bigger things that we also need to think about too, is being able to be okay with providing spaces for people to be able to share their lived experiences.
And so kind of thinking about that question, we do have a lot of students that may come from war-torn countries or countries in war conflict that do come to America. And how do we offer that, exactly what Annabelle is saying, but also systems and structures of care and compassion that we can provide that support where they're around their trauma, still, rather quickly and responsive, but still offer that space where they have a voice. Exactly what Annabelle is saying, and exactly what Dr. Torres is saying too.
Excuse me, can I make a reminder? We have a guest or a participant who needs to know your names when you are speaking. So please, if you could do that, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is Shane. Thank you so much for that reminder.
Yes, thank you, Velma. Switching gears a little bit, and Velma, please feel free to, oh, sorry, and this is Renika. Please feel free to jump in on this question, because I know that you had posed this, is many BIPOC families do not talk about or see disability in the same way we understand disability studies to be. How can we start to decolonize disability studies to include how BIPOC cultures understand and support their disabled body community members? How can we open the door for BIPOC folks to be included in disability studies so that their families can get the support, the culturally appropriate support they need?
I'm going to speak to that a little bit because we were just discussing that. I was sharing earlier, I have a large family. So full disclosure, I have about...
Please state your name.
Oh, sorry, I'm Dr. Consi Pedroza. So thank you. Thank you for reminding me. And I think that for me, I have about 46 first cousins, almost all in the state of Washington, with various levels of disability, mental health. I have an aunt and a cousin with who have schizophrenia. We have autism. We have deafness, blindness. We have physical disabilities due to diabetes with loss of limbs. So we have in my family, that's what I grew up with, and that's what I knew. And I didn't even realize that disability studies, it was just how I grew up. And not thinking through, our family just did not ever actually focus on that. It was really a work around how do we work on their strengths as a community member within our family and community, and how do we build on that to be collective in our unit, because we all love each other. We all think that everyone's incredibly incredible in our family. And it wasn't until I became an educator myself, as I'm also first generation college going person in my family. So my family was laborers, migrant workers. And so my first awareness of even understanding how people with disabilities were portrayed outside of my own family unit was impactful to me. It was learning for me. And it was something that I've had to reconcile with over and over again. Because even in how we talk about it in our systems in education, how the students are segregated in spaces, how they're segregated in different spaces was not my reality growing up. I grew up in a small town, and so I had friends who were blind and so forth in my community in wheelchairs. And so it wasn't even how I grew up in my own education, and it wasn't how I grew up with my family. So it's been a tough thing to reconcile and really be thoughtful about how do we do this really meaningfully with regards to all the cultural experiences, because we also have to recognize that some cultures also do not talk about it at all, right? And so that's the other reality of our school system when you're talking about multiple cultures and cultural experiences, which was the case with my own husband, who, when I married him, he did not have any knowledge or experience or even wanting to discuss it. And it took years and years of us being working together for him to really understand how he could support my child without blaming, right? I'm just being real. That was my own personal experience with my own spouse, because of how his culture, which is from Morocco, had discussed disabilities within their culture, or actually did not. They didn't even talk about it. And so that was a lot of work that I'm learning about. And being a former principal of Seattle World School, the impacts of how that is within different cultures, different ways of communication, even in the words that they use to describe it. I think it's something that we have to talk about and we have to address, because it does impact how students see themselves within the school community. It impacts how students see themselves within the intersectionality of race and language and culture and disabilities. And it's very impactful on students and their own identity. And I think it's very important that we address that as a system. And I don't know if we're there yet, but it's something we have to do. I believe strongly we have to do.
Yeah, this is a really, really, really dense question if you start to unpack it a bit. And I think there's a couple things in there that really stood out to me. One was just the idea of trust. Like when we think about our communities of color across the country, what is the level of trust with a system per se? And we have to remember that regardless if we're working on decolonizing, this work still represents a system. And in general, the system has had some roots that are not favorable to people of color. So in saying that, what I say is there is going to be a level of trust that is not going to be there. And so it would need to be built. And I think in some ways that can start being built through the way that it's being framed. Even the language, like when we think about the question, it is very we versus them. It's not an us language. It's like, why aren't they seeing it the way that we see it? Where some of the ways it could be approached is, how come we're not seeing it the way that they see it? And how do they see it? And how do we appreciate the way that they see it and fold that into our understanding in our language versus us trying to push, hey, this is the way that we see it. Once again, as Dr. Rocky Torres, I forgot for the captions, but versus the way that we see it and trying to project. If we're approaching situations where it's the right way or our way is the right way and others are other, we're essentially perseverating the problem that we're trying to solve for. We need to be able to go into the space with a level of appreciation, build trust to get to understanding, but then receive that understanding and think about how is it going to change the way that we see things versus us expecting people to change the way that they see things.
I also appreciate the question very much. I, kind of go back to helping my uncles, aunts, my parents, my grandparents kind of navigate any sort of system.
Please state your name.
Oh, I am so sorry. This is Shane Baguio. Thank you so much, Renika. Thank you so much for that reminder. This is Shane Baguio. I really appreciate the question. It helps me when I think about, my parents, my grandparents, my uncles and aunts, as we navigate any sort of system. When I think about, them coming from the Philippines and then them having their knowledge and then them having the US system and then them having, whether it be an issue or even a sprained ankle and knowing how to do it a cultural way versus an American way, which can oftentimes be the white way. And if that American way or a medical treatment way is not culture responsive and or not culturally respectful, it can almost be like, do we want to assimilate to that way? Or if we are doing it, is it sort of a forced assimilation? And there can be a little bit of a judgment. I have been in spaces where sometimes a family will disclose how they are dealing with a situation. And I have been in situations where, different providers are judging that family. And we do have to shed light that different families of color are really healed in different ways. And we have to be respectful of that. And also, there's a lot of courage for families of color to navigate different systems in white spaces. And so who and what are the bridges for that? And so I do really appreciate that there are a lot of different cultural navigators or cultural brokers. I know within the area of special education, I think Open Doors for Multicultural Families, not only do they do such a great job with interpretation, but also different cultural issues. And I'll put a link in the chat for them. And they do help with, early childhood all the way, even after, pre-K all the way to 21, even after with different sort of supports that way too. but really that cultural broker to kind of bridge that, because I do think that it can be very off-putting for our BIPOC families if we have institutions and systems that are not culturally responsive. And I do think those cultural brokers are very helpful in ways that can provide that bridge.
Hi, this is Annabelle. And so, I mean, just to add to what already has been said, what we often do in our classroom with our families is really to provide that opportunity to share what it is, how this label has impacted their family, whether, you know, and what their experience is with it. And so I think that, you know, even just starting at that, building that trust and starting at that and allowing that to happen. And then also incorporating that in the way that we teach our students, right? That there are many different ways and many to learn about each other. So kind of bringing it back to that, we are a community together, regardless of what your ability level is. Every ability level is welcome and part of what we do, and that we can support each other. And then having that be part of the conversation. So for example, when we're talking about, you know, because we work with using IEPs in our, you know, in a school and everything like that. Even when we're talking about our IEP goals, thinking about, you know, and this often comes up for me sometimes is that goal of learning how to use a fork and a spoon to feed yourself. When in many cultures that we are using our hands to eat, right? So even just that IEP goal in itself always gives me pause whenever people try to say, let's make that a goal for a student. And I'm like, well, is this a value for the family? Is there another way that we can address the skill that is needed to be able to, you know, hold on to something, bring it to your mouth or bring it up to somewhere and deposit food or deposit something, right? Is there something else that we can work on besides that, right? So I think that like in a classroom level kind of way, in the way that we can empower our BIPOC families, is to let them know that their voices are indeed heard, can be heard, and they should share what's important to their families. Just because a teacher is giving you an idea of what an IEP goal we should focus on for your child doesn't mean that that has to be the goal that you do, right? It is what is important to your family. And there have been times when I've asked, you know, we've asked you, should we have a goal about this? And the parents are like, no, that's not that important. Or there are times that they'll say yes because they think that's what we want to know. That's what we need to do. And that's what they need to be successful in school. When that, in fact, that is not true. You know, so I mean, in terms of like, how do we, you know, decolonizing it for families, again, at the very get-go, letting them know that, yes, there are, you know, there are cultural brokers that can help with that, but also know that you are your child's first teachers. They are their children's first teachers. They have cultural knowledge, they have funds of knowledge that are valuable and are welcome in the classroom. And not only just saying the words, but reflecting that in your class, reflecting that wherever you, in the way that you communicate with families, in the suggestions that you give, and always kind of just leaving it open for as a conversation, not this one-way street. And I mean, I've heard of many different experiences. And so it always breaks my heart whenever students leave our preschool classroom, because I'm always like, no, I don't want this family to leave, but of course they have to grow up, right? But it breaks my heart because sometimes I'll hear back from families, oh yeah, our experience was like this. Oh yeah, our experience was great. Oh yeah, our experience was not. And so I wish that as a system as well, that we can impart this to all of our educators, to all of the people that are involved. So I'm talking about even our lunchroom, you know, friends that are in the lunchroom, our custodial staff, all of the staff members, because again, it does take this community to create a system that is going to work for our families and to help them feel like they can trust us. Because yes, we have many families that school is not a safe place. And we have many families that school is a safe place. But again, that kind of mindset, so rebuilding that and creating a way for us to all kind of, yes. I think that's as much as I can say. I don't know how else to kind of wrap it up. I think I've said it already, but thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Renika here. And we have a question in the chat is, given that all of you and many of us are participants in the school system that is working within colonial ideas of education and disability, can you talk about how you are working to make change? For example, in Seattle Public Schools, there are separated classrooms where many disabled students are segregated. How are you working to change this, and how can we support that work?
This is Annabelle. I personally struggle with this a lot, this question a lot, because my classroom in particular is a self-contained classroom. It's considered a self-contained classroom, which means that all of the students in my classroom are students that have an IEP. For the most part, we do enroll up to 2 students without IEPs as peer, quote unquote, peer models. But what I also tell families is that in many ways, all of our students are peer models to each other, because not all students don't have an ability in every area, right? But back to this question, the reason why I struggle with it is because I do, and one other thing too is every special education student is a general education student first. So they are part of the general education population. They have a space within our community. I struggle with it because there are expectations and behaviors that do need to be learned, and it can be easier to do that within a classroom where that is your sole focus. And then the piece that kind of is missing is that opportunity to practice that within, because a lot of times what happens is students are identified as students that need special education services or have IEPs, and then they get quote unquote stuck, or they get that stigma, or they get a stigma associated with it. And then we go into that whole cycle, right? Of like this, where they are separate from others, right? So for me, then what should happen is that after it should be communicated that students are not quote unquote stuck in special education. The goal has always been to kind of help them become as independent as they can be within our school population, as well as to give them the tools that they need to be successful. And so the thing that I'm thinking that needs to happen is to figure out a way that those kinds of skills can be taught, as well as practiced and worked on within the general education community, which happens a lot of times. We'll see that often, like with what we have in our resource room or our access programs in Seattle Public Schools and other programming that I'm not sure what else is going there, but yeah, that's kind of one thing. So I don't know if I have a specific way to say that how we're working to change this for us personally for our classroom. The way that we do it is we are teaching those skills, and then having our students be part of our general education, assemblies. And I mean, again, it's just surface level in that sense, because it is preschool and we are in a smaller time frame. But for the rest of the school, we have a resource room program in our building. And so that just means that they are already part of the general education population. So I can't speak too much outside of my school building other than what we are doing right now. Yeah.
I'll talk a little bit on this because when I heard the question, it took me. Oh, Dr. Rocky Torres, Executive Director of Special Education. When I heard saw the question, it took me back to Shane's picture again, and I go back to what I was saying earlier about I have a very distinct feeling that if IDEA were around at that time in the late 1800s, a student with disabilities would have been in the front row as well. And I say all that to say that in order for us to even begin to think about the issue, whether it's within Seattle Public Schools or any of our large school systems, we also need to have a full recognition of the origins. Like, this is not something that is new. This is something that is entrenched in our system for hundreds of years at this point. So to untangle it is not something that's very easy. A lot of times in the work that I'm doing currently, I like to think about the technical versus the adaptive shifts. And a lot of times what school districts will do, or organizations, they'll make lots of technical pieces and policy, and let's do this and let's do that. But if you're not getting to the adaptive shift, meaning the paradigm shift, meaning the thinking behind it, and getting people to change perceptions, you're really not getting anywhere. And so I say all that to say that one of the things that we're working on, at least in the special education department for this year, is really working with our team at the central office level around the intersectionality between race and disability, the ideas of microaggression, privilege. We're starting all that work now. And the reason I think that's super important is in the role that I'm in, I can create tons of technical shifts to things. But if we're not really getting to the roots and the adaptive pieces and starting to change mindsets through professional development work, through in the coaching, in the field with our supervisors or specialists, we're really not going to get any traction. So a lot of what we're doing at this point is really getting the professional learning in front of our educators so that they can then in turn start getting into the coaching in the field when things really need to happen, in IEP type meetings, all those sort of things. In the absence of that, we can put technical changes forward and try to solve this, but we're really not going to get there. So that's kind of where we're starting to move in order to get that needle to move as far as getting away from the levels of segregation we're currently seeing.
And I'm just going to add, this is Dr. Conspedrosa. Yeah, and I'm glad, yeah, that's the other piece on that is being really intentional with our general education staff as well. Right? That's the other piece of part about that. But this is also about our general education staff having the skills and resources to support students. Not just students with disabilities, but culture responsive practices. It both go hand in hand. And so we have to make sure that we're doing that. And so that's part of the initiatives that we're thinking about when we talk about targeted universalism, also thinking about what I said in the very beginning was when we talk about decolonization, that means planning and shifting. It's about not just decolonization, it's planning for the most vulnerable person in the system. And that includes the school building, not just the institution. That includes the schoolhouse, that includes lesson designs, that includes everything from how a classroom is configured in the classroom, where students are seating, their seating charts, to actually then who gets to be in government, who gets to be on ASB, and all of these things. It means planning for that and thinking about the most vulnerable student at every level and making sure that every part of the system, from the principal to the teachers, to the school leaders, to district staff, are doing that intentionally with that in mind. And so that's what it means when we think about decolonization. It's flipping the script and planning. And so part of that is universal design. So that's one of the initiatives that the special education department is doing, is launching professional development with that mindset around how do you design for that student at the very beginning, right? Taking account of all the things that we need to be doing and then backwards map from that. And that's what the system's trying to do as well. When we think about our strategic plan and our goals and our guardrails and all of the work that we're doing in the system, everything, even when thinking about all of the policy changes and procedures, but at the schoolhouse level, it also includes what happens in the classroom lessons, the classroom designs, how we plan, even master scheduling. Students with disabilities should be factored first. They should be first in thinking about their lesson plans. But let's be honest, some of our schools, it's not done that way. It's done in a very a neutral, we need to make sure that students with disabilities are in the center of designing that master schedule to make sure that their needs are met to support the school environment. And guess what? All of the other students will benefit, because that is intersectionality at its core. And so that's what it really means, is when we think about what does inclusion mean, it means not just inclusion it's not just a mindset, it's about intentional design through all the layers of the system.
I want to add to what everyone else is saying, is that we have dug deep into, this is Shane Bruyo. Thank you so much for the reminder. This is Shane. I wanted to add to what everyone else was saying about some of the previous PD, and then I know there's some conversation in the chat around, at first it was segregated classrooms, but now we're talking about least restrictive environments. And so I was actually a part of a small team called the ESA Racial Equity Team, and ESA is Educational Staff Associates. And those are folks that are non-classroom teachers like school psychologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and speech language therapists. And what we did was we kind of thought about how can we support our special education teachers and also our general education teachers when we kind of think about this question. So we actually dug deep into our data and we were really looking at this. And so when we think about race and LRE, or least restricted environment, we do know that our Black students actually are not included in Gen Ed the least amount when compared to any other racial subgroups or any other racial categories. But a lot of questions are to pop up. And some of these questions were actually just what appeared to be questions, general questions, but they could also come off a little bit as like maybe a racial equity detours, because some of the questions were, but is it category? But is it this? Or what about this? Or what about that? And so we actually dug deep into the data. And what we saw was, right, even if you had the same category, even if you had autism, a white student with autism was still included way more than a Black student with autism in the general education setting. And so we were able to do that and show that. And we were able to communicate that out to our SLPs, our OTs, and our PTs, because they are part of the IEP teams that will now make that decision alongside the special education teacher and the general education teacher. It's about making the informed decision. First and foremost, race does matter when it comes to LRE decisions. And so we wanted to put that forward. And so there was work around that. There was professional development, and it's great to hear that there's going to be continued professional development around the intersectionality around race and disability. Thank you.
Renika speaking, thank you. I know that we talked kind of more in the beginning of this conversation just about like shared stories, but how or where can we center the needs and stories of BIPOC folks within disability studies to start decolonizing the space in the curriculum? So where can these stories be shared, and how can we use the voice of lived experience to push forward this agenda?
Hi, this is Kansi Pedrosa. I'm just going to start a little bit because we started that process last year in our system, and we've learned a lot of lessons. So hopefully I'm going to share what the lessons we've learned and then the lessons we need to continue to learn. Because for me, at the end of the day, it's about us improving, right, our thinking around what does that mean. Early on, when the pandemic hit, we were hearing from many, many families, but the families we weren't hearing from specifically was our bilingual families with disabilities. Those were the families we weren't hearing from. And that's pretty typical in our system. And I think most systems that's my background in bilingual education, and that is one of the hardest in terms of communications to reach because of all the translations. And I'll say that, so we decided to target some sessions. So we did 20 engagement sessions with bilingual, specifically focusing on bilingual families, mostly bilingual families and families with students with disabilities. And it was interesting because the one thing I learned right away in talking, we decided first to use facilitators, meaning the families, parents of those groups that also had students in our system with disabilities. That was an important factor because we knew that the facilitator needed to have the lived experience of the parents. And we were sort of awestruck because in the first month that we did this in August and September, we had over 300 families show up for 5 separate sessions, 6, I believe we did 6. And I had to listen. I just spent lots of time with the facilitators and just listening to them about what their needs were as facilitators, because they have trust in the community, right? And they didn't want to break their trust with the community by just being connected to the district, right, in that way, because they had this entity of trust, and we had to really listen to them and really think through as a system, as a district system, what is our role in these sessions, and what is the role of outside people in these sessions, and how do we really create safety for families of color, specifically bilingual families, in these space. And so that meant, which is difficult for a district because it's a public space, but really making some decisions about what we had to do to prioritize their stories, because they're sharing vulnerable truth. And it wasn't for us to use, like that wasn't for us to take. It's not for us to take, it was for us to learn. But the thing that they told us most importantly is, and then what are you gonna do about it? They didn't want to just share their stories for the sake of sharing stories. They wanted us to get back with them and tell us, what did we change? What did we do? How did their stories impact our system? And what are we still working on based on the story? So we had to go back. So they requested we go back. So we went back in January, and we went back again in spring. And we kept going back, and they're actually now emailing us and saying, when are we going to do this again? Because their stories were super impactful to the system, but we needed to honor that and show how the system was adjusting to their stories, and also not co-opting their stories for any reason. That it was really about protecting their stories and protecting their safe space. And I will share, it's shifted. And when at the end, when we asked them what if this wasn't that they wanted to continue, the number one thing they said yes, especially in the light of the racialized harm nationwide that's happening around the system. They wanted a guaranteed space that they can come together with like families with lived experiences in the same, in the same cultural group, to really sort of understand how that now is impacting, the rising hate towards Asian families, and et cetera, how that was also impacting them as a community. It was about us setting a space for them in community. And so we learned a lot of things systemically, and we're still working on getting better. It's an iterative process. It's about learning from them, of not only about how we're working with them, but also how do we make sure that we're making the improvements we need to make and prioritize them. And it's hard with lots of challenges in the system, but it means authentic engagement. And authentic engagement actually means it's engaging in the ways that the families need, and not in the ways that the system is used to engaging with families. And that takes a lot of work up front to be really clear what this group needs for authentic engagement to build trust. And that takes time. It takes time.
Renika speaking. I wanted to address Samantha's question in the chat. How can we talk about disabled parents as well when we're talking about how we're making sure that disabled parents have the opportunity to engage with the school, to support their students, to volunteer, et cetera?
Well, I'll just speak on behalf of what Samantha's saying. I think that's an important component.
Dr. Pedrosa speaking.
Dr. Pedrosa speaking, thank you. That's an important component that we need to be addressing, because I think that's important, because even thinking about how they access, like I'm looking at right now the chat, right? And I know Laura, right? And I've been in many sessions with Laura where she has a need in this space. And in a way we're being, we didn't plan for that. We didn't design the session to plan for that, right? We didn't design this for the audience, our parents and our community and the adults, but did we design our engagement, our tools able to do those specific requests and needs for those families? And so that's something we have to acknowledge in this space, because it's happened before to Laura. I know that, right? And so we have to sort of sit back and sort of think through also how we design even engagement sessions. If the audience is the adults, then we have to be mindful of the adults with disabilities in that session as well. And we need to do better by that. And so I just continually, we have to push ourselves to really be thinking about how do we center what the needs of the targeted group we're doing. And that requires us to do more on front deliberate, either messaging, communication, and just questionnaires, just access. We have to think that through. There's some things I think we could do, but we have to be really intentional about it. And it's hard because it happens to them all the time. It happens all the time. I see it happening a lot, not just in our spaces, but in the city, in the area. I'm sure nationwide. It's something we have to reconcile with, and we have to think through how to partner more authentically with the adults in our community.
This is Annabelle. I mean, just to kind of, I think really it is shifting the way that we think and in the way that we plan for things. So we are all used to planning. I mean, I'm sure that many of us on this call have planned things before. And, you know, we think about all the little things that our children might need, or our, you know, our pets or whomever is part of that thing that we are planning for. And it really is thinking about like, okay, so what if someone who needs this, this, and this comes to our space? What are we going to prepare ahead of time? And so kind of changing the way that we think and looking at how we can prepare for any possibility. And not thinking, and I know that's hard too, because usually that comes with dollars. That means that you have to pay someone or get some kind of funding. And as we know, a lot of times funding is an issue. But if we are able to think of how valuable it is to really create that space where all people feel welcome, where all people are able to participate, then I mean, I don't think there's a value on that. There's no price tag that you can put on that will, you know, replace that actual experience. So I'm waiting for that day when was it Laura that you said, Dr. Pedrosa? When Laura can come to any event and not have to worry about it.
Yeah, to build off of what Dr. Pedrosa was saying and Annabelle was saying, I think also if we're going to recognize and respond, and then we're going to plan to remove barriers, I think already then we have to know our school community so we can have intentional recruitment for our parents who we are identifying that have disabilities, because within that we know that there is a wealth of knowledge on how we can have a highly responsive system for each and every student. Because we do know that within systems of privilege and oppression, it is people and groups that are the most marginalized at the system. And then we can allow, what Annabelle was saying, allow those voices to be at the table so we can recreate and redesign and manifest a different future with them alongside. And I think similarly what Annabelle was saying earlier, but I think it starts from intentional recruitment. And so we have to seek folks out that, so we have to just be really intentional about that. So thank you so much for that question.
Dr. Rocky Torres, did you want to add anything onto that? Yeah. So to decolonize disability studies, we also have to really decolonize the whole world. Like, it's really just one little piece in this whole puzzle, or I will say. How can we start to push leadership and people in power to center disabilities when looking at accessibility? It could be into buildings, in commuting, in being included into community, i.e. like, how do we get folks to look at more accessible sidewalks, accessibility in the ways that we enter buildings, accessibility in the ways we think of building homes in buildings?
I can kind of jump in. This is Shane, by the way. I can jump in and kind of talk a little bit briefly, and then have other panelists kind of speak about it. But I think I'm going to kind of put something in the chat here. I really appreciate this question. I know Seattle Public Schools and a lot of different districts surrounding have already done a lot of great work in conversation and professional development around universal design for learning. And really kind of hitting home in that question. And really, I have put a link in the chat there, but really it's about how do we start building that system, removing barriers from the start, and kind of thinking through that there. And, you know, having accessibility all around. And so it's part of the planning, not necessarily retrofitting or doing after the fact, but already from the start. Because what we want is we want to reduce the amount of individual accommodations, but high accessibility. And so we want to kind of think about we want to not really think through disabilities, but think about barriers. So what's not really allowing people to have access and kind of thinking through that way. So I did put a link on that chat there. And I think a lot of different places and different school districts are doing that professional development, universal design for learning.
And I think that's the challenge, right? This is Dr. Constantine again. That's the challenge. We have all been educated and our lived experiences in an environment and communities that maybe or maybe not, but mostly did not center really address the intersectionality of race and disabilities within our world. I know I for sure grew up in a community that I would think was the only Mexican-American child in my entire school system. Maybe there was one other one. And then thinking about disabilities on top of that, the intersectionality, I know how I grew up and I know how most people grew up. And I think even now we're trying to, we keep, like what Rocky said, we keep doing these technical fixes. It can't be technical fixes. It has to be designing differently and rethinking things. And I think that is the most important part, and not just redesigning, because I'll be honest, it's about redesigning with the intersectionality of race and disabilities within that center. That has to be at the center of redesign. If you just do redesign from your framing of white-centric, European-centric experiences, we're gonna get exactly what we got. Nothing will change, right? Nothing will change. And so we have to do that. It can't be based on, it has to be that we have to be really intentional about it. I, as an individual, I'm always working on that. I'm always trying to work on my assumptions. I'm not perfect. I don't get them right all the time, but I own my impact when I make mistakes and I learn from them. And that's what everybody has to do. But we have to acknowledge that if people don't have a lived experience, love somebody completely, through their classroom, their teaching. I love somebody with a disability. I love two people with disabilities in my life. They are my heart and my soul. It is why I do what I do. It is why I always am thinking about it and challenging myself to learn more and do more. I have a whole community of moms that I adore that have different experiences with disabilities than I do. And I learn from them and I continue to learn myself and push myself. But everybody has, whether they have that lived experience or not, they have to push themselves to do better. And that means do their own learning. And they also must be thinking about when they're redesigning things, are they centering these students? And if they don't have the knowledge or skills to do that around them with the group of people that they have, then they need to bring different people to the table to do that redesign. It can't just be with the same people. You need to have people to push you around race, push you around disabilities, push your thinking. And but I'm going to guarantee that if you don't do that and bring the right people at the table to do that redesign, we're going to end up in the same place that we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's not going to change. And so it starts with us as people.
This is Dr. Rocky Torres, and Dr. Kansi literally took the words out of my mouth because I was sitting there, and one of the things that I was processing when I heard the question was around, I've had this experience as a school leader before, even in this role in the short time, but one of the things that I've noticed is that there are certain people that don't get activated, is a good word, I guess, for it, or interested in what this really means until it impacts them. And so it's somebody that they know or somebody in their family has been impacted. And so I think Dr. Pedrosa's spot on, because part of it is all of us who are further along in our journey of understanding this, pushing those people, because we need to get people that haven't started their journey yet to start it. And there's a lot of people who frankly are in a privileged space where they haven't had to experience disability, or they haven't had to experience any sort of aggressions or those sort of things. So those of us who have, and those people with disabilities, yeah, it's like, we shouldn't have to be the ones, but if it's not us and the allies and the advocates pushing the conversation, who is? But the root of it is to get those conversations at all those tables, because it needs to be there. And the understanding of the intersectionality, the understanding of identifiers, and how we're creating spaces based off of that needs to be there. So it's not an easy fix, it's not a quick fix, it's not a great answer, but it is where we're at in this moment.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think it's when it comes to decolonizing disability studies, it's easy then, especially in our world for disability studies, then there's always that, when we're working at the intersections, some folks always lean on one side or the other, but really our work is really at the intersections. So I do appreciate someone put in the chat anti-racism UDL, and there's a lot of great other things in that chat. So thank you so much.
This is Annabelle. I don't have anything to add to what has been said. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have just a couple minutes left here. I wanted to open it up to folks attending. If anyone had any last questions or comments they would like to add, please feel free at this time to unmute yourself. All righty. I will take that as a no. I first off want, and this is really good talking, sorry. I first off want to say thank you so much to our panelists for being here today and sharing your knowledge and expertise and insight with us. This has been another great conversation, and we thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. Also, just want to say thank you to everyone on the call who attended. These lunch and learns, they wouldn't happen if it wasn't for y'all being here. So thank you so much for being here and being part of this conversation. It is greatly appreciated. Velma, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk about our next LNL. You're on mute. There we go.
So thank you so much for attending, and thank you to our panelists. Great conversation. So our next Lunch and Learn is going to happen on October 6th. And we have invited, it's going to be about decolonizing legislative policies. So, and Dr. Pedrosa, you're there laughing and probably thinking about, oh my God, I need to be part of this. So, so I have invited Representative Mia Gregerson, Senator Saldana, Rebecca Saldana. I have invited the people from budget and policy, because they've worked a lot on the issue of taxes and some progressive pieces of legislation. I've also invited a good friend of EEC, Samet Mel, who is always talking about international work and leadership. So that would be great. Please join us. Then the following week is going to be on decolonizing the social framework. So all of this was done to be able to get you all to participate and sign up for our Equity in Education Conference, November 3rd and 5th. And I will pass it on to Renika because she's organizing that whole thing.
Yes, thank you, Velma. So yes, we have some pretty big, heavy topics coming up to end our Decolonizing Education Lunch and Learn series. And as Velma said, we are doing this series in preparation for our Decolonizing Education Conference that will be happening virtually November 3rd through 5th. And I just dropped the conference website in the chat if you want to take a look at some of the different workshops we'll be offering, as well as our keynote speakers. Yeah, take a look. Registration is still open, so be sure to get your tickets, and we're excited to see everybody there. Again, thank you so much for being on this call, and we look forward to hopefully seeing y'all in 2 weeks at our next one. So yes, thank you. Bye, everyone.